Klamath County Historical Society's May 2022 program by Michelle Durant.
As was mentioned, I'm an archaeologist for the Fremont-Wainema National Forest. Prior to the forest, I worked here in the Klamath Basin for the Bureau of Land Management as an archaeologist. I started my career over in the Lakeview area with the Bureau of Land Management, and then came over here to Klamath, and then got a position with the forest. And I've worked now on both sides of the forest, meaning I worked on the east side of the forest, which is the old Fremont, and I currently now work on the west side of the forest, which is the old Wainema, because they combined, became administratively one forest in about 2002. So so archaeology, you get your degree when you go into archaeology, become an archaeologist. Most people get their degree in anthropology. Archaeology is a subdiscipline of anthropology, and that's where you learn most of the theories and how to do field work and so forth. I have to admit a personal story. When I told my father that I had chosen to be an archaeologist, he hit the roof. He's like, "How the heck are you going to pay for your bills?" He just did not foresee what at all that there was any kind of pay or money, any kind of livelihood in the field of archaeology. And then eventually managed to get a federal job, and been working as an archaeologist ever since. And he was proud of that fact that I could pay my bills. So so archaeology has 5 goals, as I put up here, and most people are. We discover, we look for that history, the history that isn't written down, the tidbits that's between the lines, in order to give us a fuller picture of what occurred in the past. And we try to reconstruct that history, and identify, and explain those past cultures and that history to the community and those around us, again, to give us a sense of place and have a better understanding of the past and where we've come from. The biggest pieces that I'm a part of is the education piece. Obviously, I'm here giving a presentation today because I was asked what it was like to be a federal archaeologist, and and what do I do? A lot of people don't know what they have visions that are a little bit not reality. But the main thing I do is this last one on the 5th is the cultural resource management. That's what I do for the federal government. And in this presentation, I'll explain to you what that is and how the laws give me this job and the stewardship or responsibility for doing this type of management. So we'll start off with, I sort of hinted at it, what the reality of archaeology. So yes, archaeology is fun and I enjoy it. I enjoy learning about history. My favorite part is especially local history, finding and digging into the past and finding things that a lot of people aren't familiar with or didn't know about. For example, I recently did an article about the Depression era, for the Klamath Basin on bootlegging, and scoured the newspapers for that information. I really enjoy that piece, but there is a lot of, like any job, there's a lot of documentation, a lot of computer work, a lot of office work that people don't see. Instead, they highlight, they get this image in their head of archaeologists that are pretty much tied to what they see on TV in Hollywood. and yes, we have some exciting finds, but Hollywood forgets that not everybody can be an Indiana Jones. You can't. It's just like a doctor. You can't know everything about everything with a human health. It's the same kind of thing with archaeology. You can't know everything about every culture and their history for the whole world. And so, like a doctor, you specialize, and archaeologists do the same. You might specialize in as an Egyptologist, and you just do history on Egypt. My specialty is Great Basin, and we happen to be on the very edge of just of the boundary of the Great Basin cultures. So the other thing I wanted to just kind of quickly mention is that archaeology is not paleontology. So paleontology is the study of dinosaurs, and archaeology is the study of man. And we use the same tools to find out information about dinosaurs or humans. When we do excavations or surveys and that kind of thing, we use the same tools. Most people are familiar with us using tapes and brushes and that kind of equipment doing excavation, but we're studying two different things. And so if you have a question about dinosaurs, I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. So federal archaeology really began, and it's not going to, just a second. There it went. So the stewardship of archaeology under federal management kind of began in 1906. It's the first law that came onto the books, and it was basically a reaction to the fact that there were a lot of people going to the Southwest at the time and going and raiding cliff dwellings and getting pots. And you might have heard the term pot hunter before. That comes from that. So they would gather all these artifacts, and they were selling them to each other. And people were really getting concerned that we were losing that piece of that history. And so they pushed Congress to come up with a law to help combat that. And the Antiquities Act of 1906 was that law. And so it's the first law that basically said that if you're going to do an archaeological dig or learn about archaeological, used artifacts and so forth, and do research, you have to have a permit to do so. So it started to separate those who were looking at the archaeological record to learn and something versus somebody who was just getting the artifacts to sell, and they weren't interested in learning about that past and that history that those artifacts represent. And it also is the first one that, as you can see, it had a fine. Had a fine of $500 or 90 days in prison. However, it was 1906, and it doesn't have much teeth, and not many law enforcement at the time wanted to what's the word I'm looking for, to enforce it. So that brings us up. I just threw this slide in. So because it had no teeth, the next time Congress dealt in this aspect when it comes to the preservation of cultural sites via protecting the sites from looting was in 1979. And this is the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, or ARPA for short. And that was, as I mentioned, the complaint is that it wasn't, the Antiquities Act wasn't being enforced. Thus, they pushed Congress to enact something that would give more teeth, that might deter people from just going out there and messing with sites. You might ask yourself, well, why is that important? Why do we, if somebody goes in and takes a pot or goes in and picks up a point, what does that matter? Well, for archaeologists, context is the key. And if you think about it, those artifacts are pieces of a puzzle. And if we're going to read the past, we need to have all those pieces together to come up with a proper interpretation. If something is removed, now the archaeologist is looking at the pieces and they're trying to create and understand the past from what those artifacts are telling us. And if there's a key thing that's missing, then their interpretation could be false. So that's one of the reasons why archaeologists are so adamant about leave the stuff out there and leave it alone. And you can see here that the penalties did increase. So you have civil and criminal penalties, 100 years. The 100 years is, this law does pertain only to artifacts that are 100 years or older. And you're going to see in a minute, the state law is slightly different. But that's for federal lands. So I should emphasize, and I'll emphasize it again, I'm working for the federal government. So this law is federal land. I should also note, though, that if someone is to pick up something in the state and it is on private and they take it across state line, federal law kicks in. It doesn't matter where it came from, it went across state line. So as I mentioned, so Oregon has its own laws too, and I don't work with the Oregon laws every day. So the nuances, the details about Oregon laws, I'm not as familiar with. So I did bring some paperwork tonight that if you're curious and would like to pick up some materials to review, you're welcome to them. But basically, Oregon has also made it illegal to disturb a site, and but for their laws, and this is private ground and state ground, but it pertains to artifacts and sites that are 75 years. Sure. Sunlight, the more purple it gets. If you've been in an antique store and you'll see a bottle there and it's really purple and the one next to it barely, that's basically. So when we entered the war, World War I, we stopped importing manganese. And so we went for a lot of years, we had to find a different ingredient. And for whatever reason, it was the only place we brought it into this country, was from Germany. So
this bottle on your picture has no visible, one does, but the other one does
so
not.
this one's white, and I can see that it is based on this, it's either a milk bottle or it's a like a ketchup bottle, people call them. Yeah, or it could be Grandma's Falls Creamery, that's correct. So this one, some people use you see this line right here? Some people use that line as a guide. The idea is that, and I don't remember the date, I didn't bring that material with me, but basically there's a point in time where people stopped, where they started to manufacture the bottles by machines, and it left this seam, but they didn't know how to do the fine top yet, so they were still hand blowing the glass tops, so there's no seam. And then once they figured out how to invent a machine that created that bottle lip, then you have the seam goes all the way through. But I don't use that one so much, as this one's harder because it doesn't have a base on it, but bases. This one is a base, and it has what's called a maker's mark on the bottom. And I use maker's marks for my main guide for dating bottles. Hope that helps. But yeah, I have given presentations, if you want to, in the future, where I've brought artifacts and showed those little tips. Oops, sorry, we went backward. All right, so actually, this is the law that gives me my job. The other law on ARPA protects sites from looting, but the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 is what gives me my job, and it's also what sets up my inner world, I guess you could call it. It basically says there's two main sections. There's lots to this law. It sets, I mentioned it. It sets up my whole world, meaning that it sets up the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state has one that I consult with. It sets up the ACHP, which is in Washington, D.C., and how we talk to each other within the federal government. So all this inner workings, and But the two main sections of this law is Section 106 and Section 110. They've actually changed the section number 106 to something else, but everybody's so used to saying Section 106 that everybody continues to. So if you ever look it up and you're wondering why, but everybody still refers to it as Section 106. So under Section 106, anytime the federal government disturbs the ground for any reason, any reason, and I emphasize that it could be from putting a post hole in for a sign to what most people think, because I work for the Forest Service, timber sales, anything that's going to disturb the ground, then it's the requirement is to have an archaeologist go out prior to that project and see if there's anything out there culturally, and then I'm going to go into detail how I do that, but just the overview. Once I find something, then I work with the project lead and I try to find ways to mitigate or avoid that archaeological feature that's out there. So we try our best to have that project go forth and at the same time protect the heritage and the cultural resources at the same time. 110 is the fun one, I guess you could call it. Section 110 is we're supposed to take it to that next level beyond just protection. If we're going to protect these sites, we need to do something with them, and we need to learn from them, right? We need to share that with the public. If the taxpayers are paying my salary and they're having me protect these items, then I need to learn something from what I'm protecting and share what we've learned, so they're getting something for this effort. So the 110 is where we are able to go in and maybe do an excavation or do some kind of study or something where we're working toward learning about these things that we are protecting and then making that public. I should note that these laws, yes, I'm protecting these sites, but it's the location data that is confidential. So I'm not allowed to present locational data. And again, it's to protect them from being looted. The law also, National Historic Preservation Act also, or NHPA, that's what a lot of archaeologists and folks working in my field call it. It also sets up the National Register of Historic Places. And the National Register of Historic Places is something where you would then look at every one of these sites and you're kind of determining if it's eligible to this register, if it fits under one of these categories, then it elevates it up above others. And then you're sending basically that cream of the crop, as you could say, of sites we're going to put even more effort into protecting. And that information then gets stored at the with the keeper, with the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. And you can look that stuff up. And there's several, you guys, because you're a historical society, you might be familiar with several of the buildings in town here that are on the National Register down this way. What used to be the dental, did I get that right? The medical, yeah, that one's on the register. So, and when a site like that is on the register, they're required to have a plaque and information about the history of it. So when you go into that building, there's all that information's on the wall. And so it's that's all part of this law. So as I meant, so here we've got the 106 review process, and I'm going to kind of keep coming back to this because this is the process that I follow when I'm doing my job. And I already mentioned to you, I have a project lead that's coming to me. They want to dig a hole to feed cattle, to water cattle. So they're initiating that process with me. So they give me a map, they show me where it is, and I head out there. So they've initiated that process. I determine at that moment in time if the project that they have presented to me fits, is a 106 undertaking, is the word they use in the law, or is not an undertaking. So I make a decision at that point of whether I'm going to take it a step further or if I'm done. And I just happen to have project that came to my table yesterday, it wasn't a 106. And I was able to send an email to the individual and say, thank you for, for contacting me to ensure that you've done an HPA, but your undertaking is not a 106. Go forth and enjoy. do your project. I have no more, I will not be touching it anymore. But as part of the process, so now, so let's pretend I've got this grazing hole that they want to build. And so the next piece would be to identify those historic properties out there. I'm going to go out there. Well, how do I do that? And oh, I need to step back. I threw a bunch of slides in there to make sure I didn't forget things. I was also a part of that piece in the very initial beginning. Once I determined it's an undertaking, it's also where I need to step back and start to consult with our partners. And I already mentioned the State Historic Preservation Office, and every state has one. So I consult with them. I also consult with tribal partners. And in this case, since I work for the Fremont Wainema, I consult with the Klamath tribes. So we have phone calls and letters going back and forth on a regular basis. And they are a federally recognized tribe. And we do have a memorandum of agreement between the forest and the tribe on that takes a step further of how we're going to consult with each other, when, where, who, that kind of thing. When I worked on the east side of the forest, I worked with the Fort Bidwell Indian community as well, because their traditional territory came up into the Warners.
Michelle, what is the tribal name for the Fort Bidwell?
I can't pronounce that, I'm sorry. And I don't want to be disrespectful and try. That's their name for themselves. Oh, sure. Actually, it's not. Fort Bidwell's down here. So here's Goose Lake. And so Lakeview would be about right here. And here's the Warner Mountains. So Fort Bidwell is just over on into the California side of things. And right here, kind of where the corners of Nevada, California, and Oregon meet. So this is what most people think of when we're thinking about ground disturbance, right? We're thinking big equipment, big machinery. But and that's why I threw that in here. Just, you can really mess up a site with big machinery. So we do practice on the forest. Our the main thing of mitigation that we practice is flag and avoid. So we flag them and then tell the project lead where they are, and then they try to avoid them with this big equipment. But as I mentioned, it could be as small as somebody out there with a shovel digging a hole for a post. So it doesn't have to be this big equipment, but most people I speak to, this is what comes to mind. So I just threw it in there. So how do we find this stuff? So we do an archaeological inventory. And as you can see here, I put kind of a list of names. There's all kinds of names in the literature for the surveys that we do. But basically it's a systematic walk. We walk the ground. I don't know if you can see in this picture, this is a survey that I was the crew lead on, and these are my crew members, and we're walking across the Scab Rock Flat for our feature sale. And actually this was a timber sale that was in the area. But when you talk to an archaeologist, or if you look this stuff up online, there's just a number of different ways or terms that are used to reference the fact that we're doing a systematic walking across the landscape looking for stuff on the surface of the ground. I should note that that it is on our Code of Federal Regulations, and you see down here I have it. So where are we doing this survey? And I mentioned a timber sale, or I mentioned a post. So what we call the law, we have area of potential effect, APE. I'm teaching you guys all our lingo. APE just means any place where we might disturb something. So the post idea The AP probably is just right there where somebody came up with their ATV and is just really tiny footprint. But for a timber sale, an APE is going to be quite large. Not only we're looking at where they're actually cutting the timber, we're looking at the roads accessing it, because they're going to be putting their maybe trucks are going to be pulling off, or there is slash piles, or there's just, it starts to become like a spider web of area that it's covering. So much more than just this nice, neat little spot on the map. And now that I said nice, neat spot, I use that nice, neat spot as an example. So how do I know where and when I'm going to survey? Our surveys or areas can be quite large. And so what we do is, this box that you see here is our APE. It's a project is within that box. And so I use records and archival research, and I use background. I do a bunch of background research, and I look at past surveys, and I determine if past archaeological surveys are adequate or not. And with that, I make a decision. I may decide that the 2015 survey was a good survey, but the 1996 was flawed, and so we don't. There may be sites in there, and we're going to go revisit those known sites that were found during 1996, but we're going to resurvey it because we think it might show up something in addition to what they found in 1996 might show up. So then I'll plot in here the area that we're going to survey for that particular project. There are two designs. Most of the survey, intensive survey that we do here on the forest, we do when we cross the landscape. It's called a transect, and our transects are 20 meters apart. There's other agencies that do slightly larger, maybe 30 meters, or maybe depending upon whatever the project is, maybe they'll get as small as 5 meters. And here in our area, the Klamath tribes do not like excavation. So we don't, other areas, they might do a little shovel test every 30 meters or something on their transect. They're especially fond of this back east. But we don't practice that kind of a survey here because of the Klamath, it's our relationship with Klamath tribes, and they don't want us to do that. And what is it we're looking for? Archaeological sites. And what are those? It's basically where humans have lived, worked, and they've left the tangible remains behind of what they were doing in that particular location. And those areas, discrete areas or site, is made up of either artifacts, features, or both. And artifacts are anything that you can pick up and walk away with. So this mouse right here is an artifact, man-made, something I can pick up and walk away with. So maybe in the future, 100 years from now, we'll have different technology, and they might be excavating this building and find this mouse. And it's a remnant artifact of the day, when we were here. And the features are something that's man-made that you can't walk away with. So in that scenario, 100 years or whatever long, 1,000 years from now, this building's gone, but what remains is maybe a little bit of the foundations. Foundations aren't something somebody's going to pick up and walk away with. That is a feature. So, and then we also look at both historic and prehistoric sites. Prehistoric is can change depending on where you're working. Some people in Oregon do the fine line between historic and prehistoric when Lewis and Clark came in. I tend to locally just use the line of 1880. I'm gonna mess it up. 1826. Does anybody know what 1826? What happened in 1826 here? Huh? Peter Ski and Ogden came in to the area. Peter Ski Ogden came as an explorer into the Klamath Basin. There was one group that was here the year before, but they stopped off at Klamath Marsh and then turned around. Peter Ski and Ogden was the first Euro-American that came in with a journal writing and who came further down into the basin. So I kind of use that as my guide of what's, you know, what's history, where the cutoff is between history and prehistory. All right, so I thought I'd throw in a bunch of pretty pictures. Everybody likes pretty pictures. What is it we're looking for? Some of our main site types that we have around here. A big one is lithic scatters. We have a lot of obsidian sources here, and the Native Americans took full advantage of that material and made lots of tools with those obsidian. And you can see in this middle picture, you'll see these flakes on the ground and leftover material from making those tools. The we're just going to go through some site types just for fun. Another feature that we find around here, the Klamath tribes practiced putting stone one on top of the other like cairns, and it was part of their religious practice, and they would pray when they did this. And so we find a lot of these religious features all over the landscape, all over the forest. We also find what we call their culturally modified tree, and in this case, it's a cambium tree. And a cambium tree is, when you look in some of the historical literature, they called it like a starvation food. I kind of disagree with that, but I don't think they were starving. I just think it was in the very beginning, the first food that is available. The snow's still on the ground, but nothing else has come up yet. No greenery has come up yet. The first fresh food that's available after eating all your stores all winter long, and now you're sick of what you had, you know, you're tired of it. The first available fresh food is the cambium on the inside of the bark of the tree. So it's right on the inside between the wood and the bark is this thin layer of cambium, and the tree starts to like wake up from the winter, and it starts to so the sap starts to move through that cambium, and it's sweet. That's what I've been told, it's sweet. So they harvested that, wouldn't you, if it was sweet? And it's something new and something different than what you've been eating for several months. So that's why I disagree that it was a starvation food. I don't think they were starving. I just think it was the first available different food and fresh food. We also find out their groundstone. So things that where the tribal folks ground their roots and seeds to create their versions of like bread or meal, that kind of stuff to eat. And this center picture is a bedrock mortar. And then of course we have historical stuff, and we have the remains of homesteaders' cabins. We have the remains of ranching across the landscape, CCC stuff, roads. We even have another culturally modified tree, but in this case, it's a historical one called arborglyphs or dendroglyphs is another name for them. This is where the sheep herders carved their names into aspens when they were in the early 1900s, when they were up in the mountains with their herds. So we have some of these on the forest. There are some here on the west side, but the majority I found are seen is on the east side. There's a heard of Paisley. There's a lot of sheep herders that lived in Paisley, that area. Railroad grades, logging. So lots of history associated with that. And with that logging and homesteading, one of our biggest site types that we look at are can scatters, associated with that historical time frame. And I have had people say, well, it's just a can. But if you think about it, they're going away. They're dissolving as we speak from the weather and stuff. And we're getting more and more as technology is changing. You notice in the stores that less and less cans and more like a paper box type materials that are packaging our food. So soon, I mean, down that road, you look into the future, we probably won't be using metal anymore to contain our food. So these things are becoming as just a stain in the ground as time goes on. And now's the time to kind of learn about how people lived when they were in a logging camp, or how they lived when they were on a homestead. These cans help us identify the foods they were eating. Maybe it will indicate how rich they were. Were they able to afford, something fancier than just the beans and canned milk or something like that. So it just kind of helps you kind of understand the past, that more and more the generations, like my daughter is 17, she has no connection whatsoever to the 1930s, doesn't understand that what it was like to live then. So let's see, the other piece, and I mentioned it earlier. So once we find all these sites, then I mentioned already that the National Historic Preservation on the Act has the National Register of Historic Places. And so we do try to then identify whether or not the sites that we find on the landscape fit within the categories of the register. And so that's evaluating the sites is how archaeologists refer to it. And we then also kind of come up with the criteria of effect. We try to look at the project and we try to determine with our mitigations how much effect is going to be on these archaeological resources. How is the project going to affect them, to say it simply. So, and we tried to get down to zero effect, which is why we do a lot of flagging and avoiding. Try to minimize it as much as possible. There is other agencies that's not possible. ODOT, for example, the road can only go where the road's going to go. So they may excavate and completely remove the materials from a particular site in order to preserve what's the history and the information from that site, so that they can put a road in. We have here in the Forest Service, we're lucky we can do a flag and avoid. The loggers can go around it. They don't have to go through it, and then so the site can remain on the landscape and stay there until hopefully we have an opportunity to research it.
Before you go,
Mhm.
there's on your bottom of, it says stealing. What does
Yeah.
that mean?
So that's usually referring to like a historical structure. What's the feeling that it's portraying or telling you or presenting to you? And maybe
That's a very personal thing now.
it is.
So how do you judge it?
So you have to write how you feel about it. What do you think you and others in the community, what does it mean to others? And you try to capture that on paper and convince somebody else that is a valid reason why to protect it and why we need to put it on the register. The one that comes to mind right away for me is the Mitchell Monument. Mitchell Monument.
Yes, I was just thinking of that.
Yeah, so there are certain sites and places and things that have that. There's that depth that goes deeper than the physical. And so that's a historical example. Maybe it's prehistoric, maybe it's a spot that's a traditional practitioner had been coming to that spot forever for the Klamath tribes. And it has a deeper meaning for that individual and the individuals that they're associated with. So you have to tease that out with the folks, talking to different folks, and you try to weave that in if you can.
That could be a real can of worms, though, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean, some people feel this way and some feel that way. Boy, I hate to have to judge something on that.
Mm-hmm. I've always been interested. I never have done it, but I've had people come and mention that there was a particular hunting site that the family's gone to for generations, and they would like it preserved. So it has that feeling for them, but that may be a clash, as you said, with something that in the area with a tribal. So you're right, it does. So you're trying to bring everybody to the table And you know, that's you're gonna try your best to bring everybody to the table and come up with a.
Well, I'm glad it's your job, not mine.
And there was a hand raised, yes.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So on tribal lands, they have their own rules, right? Is there any crossover to the national rules that you're under? If artifacts are found on tribal lands, what if there are artifacts of historic nature for the Oregon Trail coming through and on that? If there are no rules, is there a spirit of cooperation?
There is a spirit of cooperation, and I don't know per se if there's no rules. They still need to follow the National Historic Preservation Act because they're usually using government funds to do stuff. And as soon as government funds are involved, the National Historic Preservation Act kicks in.
Okay. Without that,
Without-
they have their own rules.
So some tribes do, have their own internal
There's no-
stuff.
There's no across the board consistency.
Correct. Yeah.
Your
Some
original-
tribes are big enough and they have what's called a TIPO. So their version of a SHPO, which is a tribal historic preservation officer, and their own rules. And then federal agencies will work with a TIPO when it comes to tribal lands. So yeah, there's it, but for the most part, the tribes are on board with the National Historic Preservation Act.
Can I ask?
Mhm. Sure.
When you're talking about tribal lands, what consists of tribal lands? Because they were recognized, but the reservation.
Okay.
wasn't.
This is here, what used to be tribal lands is the Wainema National Forest. The Klamath tribes, they lost their recognition, if you remember, in the 50s, mid-50s, and they lost the reservation at that time. They were able to gain back in the mid-80s their recognition and their hunting and treaty rights, but they didn't get their reservation back, which is why they've been working so hard recently to buy pieces and start to build their own footprint, I guess I could say, on the landscape and try to revive that reservation. So with the federal agencies, we're working with the tribes to hopefully maintain their hunting and fishing rights. But yeah, the National Historic Preservation Act still applies. Is that answered? But you have different, you mentioned tribal lands, and I'm thinking when I mentioned that, I was thinking of Warm Springs. And Warm Springs still has a reservation. So. But you
I
just.
looked around, I think, and now
All right, so the final piece for me anyway is reporting. And if I don't report it, it never happened. And that's pretty much what it boils down to. So when we're out there in the field, we come across sites, I'm reporting everything I see. When I come in, I'm entering it into a database. This picture that you see here is the database I currently use that the Forest Service has built, and they just relatively recently put this database together. It's a national database, and so it's, oh goodness, maybe 8 years old, maybe anyway, something like that. And it's across the board to the whole United States. And their point was that you could go to any Forest Service office across the United States and they're using the same database, was their hope. We're all using the same thing. It's also, the database is designed so that there's little carrots if we do little things. It records what we've done, and it puts together a report for Congress. So it does report to Congress every year in the fall. No, that's Bly. So you can see that. So the bottom piece down here is the form, and it has all the tabs that you open up and fill in your information into these boxes. Up here is similar to GIS. It's a map. And I can bring this up and down and increase in the size of that map. And then I can put a site in here. And in this case, that round dot right there is the site. And so it records that. And in that case, the site is, this is the number for the site. And the site happens to be the Bly Ranger Station. And so all the information we have about the Bly Ranger Station hopefully is on this form. Sure.
So I'm out driving some way
Mhm.
sometime, and I don't know where I'm going, and I get lost, and I park my car and I go walking, and I find what I think is an artifact.
Mhm.
I have no idea where I am. Who do I go talk to first?
So you take a photo of it,
Don't
and
touch it?
you can pick it up and look at it. You just put it back. Just put it back. Don't take it with you. Take a photo of it. And these days, most people have phones, and you can mark yourself, mark where it was. And then once you figured out whose land you're on, you can, if it's a private person, you could tell the private person if you really want to. If it's federal, then you'd figure out who the, if it's Forest Service, who's the Forest Service agency, where the closest ranger station is. Anyway, and get a hold of them and find out the archaeologist and say you'd like to, to submit this information about an artifact you found, a possible artifact you found.
Is there a place that has centralized maps, since I'm lost and I don't know where I am, that tells me I'm on private land, I'm on public land, I'm on tribal lands? Is there a place to go to determine
Well,
who to go take it to?
so we use topo maps and topological maps, USGS topological maps. And most usually on those topological maps, they'll tell you private, is it not showing the town site? On that one, I guess it's not a good example, but it will tell you on there what's federal, whose land is whose, that kind of thing. And most maps will have some kind of note on there about whose land is whose, except private, it will just be private. No, they're not going to tell you who owns the private. You have to go to the title company for that.
Well, if I never make it back, it doesn't matter anyway, right?
I don't know about that.
You become part of the historical record.
That's true.
I just stay there. and
You
become
just, you
part of
do.
it.
Yep. Yeah, I forgot to mention earlier that as part of the National Historic Preservation Act, since you mentioned the archaeological record, the act pointed to the Secretary of Interior and said, you will create like rules, I guess you could call it. And in what they came up with was that we were all going to follow, and anything that's 50 years or older, these laws apply to anything that's 50 years or older. So, Secretary of Interior standards. Yeah, so yeah, I hear that a lot. I'm now a historic artifact. So, and then when you mentioned that, that's what came to mind. And the last thing is we do write up our, we put everything in the databases. We write up what's called a SHPO report. So we show in that report everything we surveyed, what we found. We provide copies of the site forms, and we send this off to the State Historic Preservation Office. We say that we feel that the project, in my scenarios, we've avoided everything, so thus the sites are not going to be affected. And so we feel that there's no effect to the sites. We make that determination. We send it to SHPO. SHPO is like a checks and balance. They read our report, and then they decide whether they agree with us or not. And if they disagree with us and they don't concur, then they come to us and say, well, have you thought about this or check this, or that kind of thing. And then we work it out until we've come to an agreement. And then once that consultation is complete, the project can go through. So should have written it down. ACHP, archaeological. I'm sorry, I've gone blank on what ACHP stands for.
I'll understand that.
So, anyway, the ACHP is the next level above. So you have the agency, SHPO, and then you have ACHP in Washington, D.C. And they are a group that kind of maintains and watches over the NHPA law. And they are the ones that are also kind of a judge and jury. If I'm, of course, making this very simple, but basically if the agency and the SHPO don't agree, we can go to ACHP. Once and we present our cases, and they will say whether they agree with the agency or SHPO, and we can move forth or not. Anyway, they're the ones that have the final say. They're also the ones that are the final say when it comes to anything ACHP, ACHP, when it comes to the NHPA law. So if there's any change in the law or an interpretation or anything like that, they're the ones that maintain it at that level.
Michelle,
Mhm.
if you and SHPO disagree
Mhm.
totally
Mhm.
about the site, would they bring in another archaeologist?
That could be one of the,
to evaluate?
yeah, they can. Mhm. I've seen that once in my career. Doesn't happen very often, but it has happened. And usually ACHP doesn't step in until it's something big. I mean, like when the dozers hit and I can't remember how many years ago this was, when they disturbed a part of the Trail of Tears, and it hit national news. Usually ACHP is the one in the background dealing with that. So they're usually at that higher level. But like I said, it has happened at a lower level. I've only seen it once though in my career. It doesn't, like I said, doesn't very often. Most of the time the agency and SHPO is able to work things out and agree. So sorry, I was getting rid of that one bar that came down. So I thought you might be curious. So what am I managing on the Fremont Wainema National Forest, right? What is it that I'm doing all this work for and protecting and managing? So I'm basically, I manage the heritage program for the whole West Side, meaning I cover the heritage program for Klamath, Chiloquin, and Chemult. And I have a couple people that work under me. I do go to the field occasionally. I don't go as much as I used to because I am managing it more, and I'm telling folks that we got this project, we gotta send you guys over here, or this project we gotta send you over here. So unfortunately, as I've moved up the ladder, I've become more of a paper pusher, but I still enjoy what I'm doing. So just to let you know what we're managing, it's over 7,000 sites, known sites across the forest. So this is across the forest, this isn't just the west side, it's the whole forest. And we're adding new sites all the time. We have on the books, in the database, this is what I got out of the database today. We have over 700 past surveys. But I know that we have more surveys that have been done across the forest than that. We're just catching up and getting those digitized and into the new database. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with that same kind of thing. People weren't, technology is still relatively new. We're trying to get everything in. So I expect that number is going to increase significantly over the next few years. I manage approximately 60 projects, not me personally, but around 30 for the west side and 30 for the east side. That's where I got that number. And I counted my projects this morning, wrote up my hand. 36 already this fiscal year that I have touched in some way, shape or form. So I'm already above my 30, which I would used to say was an average. And I feel that number is going to increase with the infrastructure bill and the emergency bills that were recently passed. So those numbers are definitely going more projects, more people on the ground, definitely going to increase. And I mentioned that. And that's, I should say, new projects. I do keep having past projects resurrect themselves. They just keep coming because we've done NEPA or whatever 5-6 years ago, and now a person wants to do a timber sale with that NEPA from a while back, and so they come to me with this. Okay, I know you did out there and you were flagging out there 5 years ago, but we're just now getting into contracting. Could you guys go out there and reflag them again? So it happens a lot. And so I do have projects coming in that are like that. So new and continuing. So a big part of my job is tracking all of that, and these multi-year projects, tracking all of that. And so it kind of boils down, I thought about, oh, I did a funny thing with I took my square and I put it in a circle and cut it off. That was your heart before it burned. That photo. I kind of was thinking about it. It's like, it kind of boils down to, even though I've given you all this nuance of what I do, kind of boils down to I'm an advocate for the resource. I'm out there trying to protect it and trying to bring the attention to it for both the public and for my land managers. The maintaining that consultation, that communication between everybody, as well as protecting my supervisors from not breaking the law. I'm their expert, so they come to me and say, okay, I'm thinking about doing this or doing that, and you know, how's this going to fit in to make sure that they don't that they follow the law and don't break it. So that is in a nutshell what we do. Any questions?
How do you get to these remote locations?
Well,
Do you ride a motorcycle or a horse? No motorcycle.
no motorcycle, no horse. Mostly drive and hike into wherever. I was ATV certified there for a while, and sometimes I use an ATV, but ATVs have become kind of, well, first there weren't very many. They were scarce on the forest. They were scarce. There wasn't very many, so it was hard to get one. The timber folks would be using one, but they're also now kind of considered a safety hazard. So because we don't really, because you got to get them in a trailer in the back of a pickup, and so they're moving away from ATVs and doing more UTVs. You know what those are? The side by sides that you see, very popular now, but those are pretty expensive. So there's only so many. So pretty much I hike. I used to tell people I get paid to hike.
Not motorcycles,
No motorcycles.
because motorcycles seem so practical. Cowboys in some places
I use
use
them.
motorcycles.
Yeah, I have seen that.
It seemed like it might be ideal.
Yeah.
But no,
But no, yeah, we don't use motorcycles. Not on this forest anyway. Maybe they use it on another forest, but not on this one. And there was another question.
How did the forest fires affect your job?
Oh, good question. So I am red card certified, which means I've gone through fire school, and they can call me whenever there's a fire. So say there's a lightning strike, and the forest fire, the fire managers, FMOs, I've given them ahead of time maps of kind of generally where stuff is, so that they have an instant reference. And then they call me, and I can go out on the fire line and check things or help them out with, you know, if they can move a dozer line, or if they can move a hand line to avoid a site, we try to. But we always emphasize that life and property is number one. So nobody needs to lose a life for protecting a cultural site. But if the initial attack's over and they're just mopping up, or they're, you know, the fire is relaxed enough, and they can, while they're mopping it, and can use machinery and go around something, then that's great. We try our best to do that. There is a little line in the law that says that the law National Historic Preservation Act, in an emergency, doesn't have to, you don't have to worry about it. It does kind of suspend it for a minute.
So that would be a good example. Brought up the Mitchell Monument,
Mhm.
and so they protected that. from what
Correct.
we understand. They
Correct.
really put a lot of effort
Mhm.
into protecting that.
Correct.
last fire.
So I was on the bootleg when that happened. And so my job, and I'm in the background. And so most people don't even realize there's an archaeologist on fires, but there are usually they call them arcs on fire. But when you're on an incident, you're feeding them to team any information about priority sites, things that you're trying really hard to protect. So on the bootleg, when it started moving east, it was moving fast. And so I was trying to get ahead of it and like trying to predict, well, where it might go. And so one of the first ones I brought to their attention was Merritt Creek Trestle. And unfortunately, we lost Merritt Creek Trestle. Like I said,
Lost what?
we lost it. It burned.
Lost what?
Merritt Creek Trestle, the railroad trestle. And the trestle crosses Merritt Creek out there by Sycan. The one side of the trestle was on private and one side's on Forest Service. But it's on the OC&E Railroad and it's a state park. So it's also state. And tried really hard, but if you're familiar with the area, you know that trestle was right there next to the Sycan Estates. And the firefighters were focused on Sycan Estates. And so I fully understand. I was sad that we lost it, but I understand why they were trying to get people out and save people in their property on Sycan Estates. And then when it got to that point, then it started marching toward Gearhart. So my next effort was Mitchell Monument. So I started pushing and emphasizing it in meetings and trying to say we need to protect it, calling anybody I could think of that was local resources that I knew. And so we were able to get an engine out there. And they were also able to get a hold of, they had a couple of loggers that were helping on the fire. And so they were able to, you might have seen it actually, we just did a thing for the Bend TV. I don't know if you saw the video, but we just out there because they were asking that. So we wrapped the site and we were able to get out there and wrap it to help protect it from the fire. They were able to get to drop red retardant around it. And then, yeah, the loggers were there was a couple the last ones there when they left, fire was there. And then it was just keep your fingers crossed. And we got lucky. It went and it burned the fence, but the trees were protected. The monument itself didn't get touched. And so all the Forest Service has to do is replace the fence that we have. But yeah, we got lucky very lucky. But I mean, we did get in there and we tried to put something in there as best we could to protect it, to give it the best chance. And so I'd like to hope, I'm hoping that our efforts were part of the reason that it was protected. Yes.
Just realized I had a question, curious question. You'd be happy with this answer. I kayaked Williamson Canyon today.
Which one?
Williamson.
Oh, Williamson. Okay.
As I went down, the dirt road from the campsite.
Mhm.
And I've been doing that ever since the fire. Luckily, the fire reached the National Canyon right there. Every time I go by, there's that burnt out car.
Oh.
There. Now it's got lots of bullet holes in it. I just was always curious. Was that person
So-
okay? That car's.
Yeah, so we did lose some vehicles and some equipment, some logging equipment.
This was somebody. It looks like a little.
Mhm.
Looked like it was a pretty nice car, a smaller car.
And I haven't heard of
I've always been
anybody.
curious
Yeah.
about that.
I don't know as particulars of that. I do know that nobody lost their life on everything. So that's all. But there are some places on the bootleg where you still will see some of the logging equipment that they haven't, the loggers haven't gotten in there to move it. And unfortunately, we also have some folks who have brought in garbage since the fire. It happens. Unfortunate, but it happens. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.